joining me today at Take 5. In this series of teachings, we're looking at the available, and I'll say it this way, at the available New Testament provision of God's strengthening grace for us as believers. It's the power of Christ, the power of God that can be ministered to our inner man, strengthening us on the inside, enabling us and making us capable of doing all the things that we need to do in this life. That's why Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That was the same Jesus Christ that said to Paul in his dire circumstances, I'm not going to change your circumstances. I'm going to empower you. And Jesus delivered to Paul the revelation of strengthening grace that revolutionized his life. So we've looked at strengthening grace from the point of view of Paul's revelation of strengthening grace, his experience of strengthening grace, and now we're looking at Paul's prayers concerning strength and strengthening grace, and then we'll finish in our next teachings by looking at Paul's exhortations to grace. So we looked at one of his prayers in Ephesians 1, a beautiful prayer. If you are just joining for the first time, then you can go back to some of the other teachings and pick that up. But in Ephesians chapter 3, Paul prayed another prayer for believers. He prayed a prayer in Ephesians 1 that their eyes would be open to this exceeding great power available for them, the same kind of power that raised Christ from the dead. And now in Ephesians 3, he says this. Ephesians 3 verse 14, he said, for this cause, for this reason, I bow my knees to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, of whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named. So Paul's praying. He's bowing his knees. He's speaking to the Father about something. He's praying for believers, talking to the Father about believers. What's he talking to the Father about? Listen to this. He said, what I'm praying is that He, God, would grant you. Man, you know what? Getting a loan is okay, but getting a grant is better. Because if you get a loan, you borrow it and you have to give it back. When you get a grant, it's yours. And a grant usually comes from someone who's quite wealthy to help someone else who has a vision do what they want to do but don't have the means or the capacity or the ability to do. So when you have a vision and want to do it but can't do it because you don't have the means to do it, you can go to someone with the means and say, could you give me a grant? And they grant it to you. It's yours. You take it, you use it, and you do your vision, your dream. That's a grant. A grant is good. Paul says to believers, he said, I'm praying that God would grant you, according to the riches of His glory, to be strengthened with might by His Spirit in the inner man. This is one of our greatest needs as New Testament believers, is to be strengthened in our inner man. And you know what? That's why Paul's praying about it. Why is he praying about this? Because it is a tremendous need. If we are not strong in our inner man, we cannot live the life we're called to do. We cannot resist temptation. We cannot run our race. We cannot stand in tests and trials. We cannot fight the good fight of faith. We cannot carry the burden God has given to us, called His will for our lives. There's a yoke we have to wear. You cannot wear that yoke if you're weak. And so if we're weak, we fail. But if we're strong, we prevail. So Paul said, I am praying that out of the rich treasury of His glory, God would strengthen you by His Spirit in your inner man. What is Paul praying about here? He's praying about strength. He's praying about strengthening grace. He's praying about the inner man being fortified. You know, in the Amplified Bible, Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, talks about an infusion of strength. You know what fusion is? Fusion is when two things join and become one, and power is produced. Well, when you join the grace of God with your strength, drawing His strength with your strength, and there's the infusion of His power, then there's a release of power, and you can do what you're called to do. We need an infusion of His strength. Thanks for joining us today at Take 5.